If you grew up watching Popeye cartoons, you remember that little baby and the one in the long white nightgown crawling into trouble while Popeye scrambled to keep up. Swee'Pea was always just sort of there, part of the scenery, easy to overlook, but that little character has a history that is genuinely surprising, full of strange decisions, identity confusion, and details that never made it onto the screen. This is the real story of Swee'Pea, and some of it will catch you completely off guard. Fact 1. He arrived in a box. Most characters in comics are introduced through a story. Swee'Pea just showed up at the door, literally. On July 24, 1933, E.C. Segar's comic strip Thimble Theatre ran a panel where Popeye found an abandoned infant on his doorstep, so delivered to him in a box like a package. No explanation, no return address. No one ever came to claim him. The identities of his biological parents were never revealed in the original strips. Not that year, not ever. Segar simply dropped a baby into Popeye's life and let the sailor figure it out from there. Popeye, who had no business raising a child by any reasonable measure, did what he always did. He didn't overthink it. He just decided the kid was his, and that was that. For Depression-era readers who understood what it meant to take care of someone without being asked, that moment landed hard. But before Popeye could raise this baby, he had to give him a name, and what he came up with was something else entirely. Fact 2. The name nobody uses. Swee'Pea is a nickname. The actual name Popeye gave that baby, officially. Shine in the August 17, 1933 strip was Schooner, Sewell, Georgia, Washington, Christopher, Columbia, Daniel, Boom. Every single word of that. It's one of the most gloriously absurd names in the history of newspaper comics. A jumbled string of American references that sounds like Popeye just grabbed at anything patriotic that crossed his mind and kept going until he ran out of breath. Nobody in the strip used it. Nobody in the cartoons used it. The name appeared once, was never seriously revisited, and Swee'Pea remained Swee'Pea for the next 9 decades. But it tells you something about how Segar wrote Popeye. The humor was always buried inside the details, and sometimes you had to look closely to find it. The nickname itself, though, had a history before the baby ever arrived. Fact 3. Swee'Pea was Olive's nickname first. And here's one that surprises people. The name Swee'Pea didn't originate with the baby. In the Fleischer cartoon, We Aim to Please, Popeye uses sweet pea as a term of endearment when talking to Olive Oyl, before any infant existed in the storyline. It was just something Popeye called her, the kind of old-fashioned affectionate nickname that was common in that era. When Segar eventually introduced the foundling baby into the comic strip, the name migrated over. The baby became Swee'Pea. Olive's nickname became the child's identity, and the whole thing was so quietly done that most readers never caught the connection. It's a small detail, but it gives the name an extra layer. This baby wasn't just named after a flower, he was named with the same word Popeye used when he was being tender. That actually says something about how Popeye felt about the kid, even if he'd never admitted out loud. Fact 4. His first word was glop. When Swee'Pea first started appearing in the comics, Segar didn't give him any real dialogue. The only sound the baby made on the only thing he ever said was glop. That was it. One word, used for everything, in every situation. Crawling into danger, glop. Being picked up by Popeye, glop. Staring down a villain, glop. It became a running gag that actually worked because it was so committed. Segar didn't break character on it. The baby communicated everything through expression and action, and glop served as a kind of all-purpose sound that audiences found genuinely funny. And it wasn't until the 1938 storyline King Swee'Pea, written in the final months before Segar's death, that the character began speaking actual words. And even then it happened slowly, as if the strip wasn't quite ready to let the joke go. But when Swee'Pea did start interacting with the world, he turned out to be far more capable than anyone expected. Fact 5. A baby who could fight. In 1935, Segar introduced a storyline called Gold Rush in Slither Creek, and it changed everything people thought they knew about Swee'Pea. In that arc, the baby, still crawling, still in his nightgown, still looking like any ordinary infant, started defeating full-grown adult adversaries in physical confrontations. Not through spinach, not with any explanation, just a crawling baby who, when the situation called for it, could hold his own against larger and experienced opponents. It became a recurring gag that the strip kept returning to, and it worked because it was played completely straight. Popeye was surprised by it the same way the readers were. The contrast between how Swee'Pea looked and what he could actually do became one of the character's defining qualities. A baby with the soul of a fighter, which fit right in with the rest of the Popeye universe. And that baby's identity was about to get a lot more complicated depending on which version of the story you were reading. Fact 6. Nobody agrees who he belongs to. In the original comic strip, there was no ambiguity. Swee'Pea was Popeye's adopted son, plain and simple. Popeye called him his boy kid and raised him as his own, but when the Fleischer Studios animated cartoons came along, And things got murky fast. In the cartoons, Swee'Pea was regularly shown in the care of Olive Oyl, and whether he was her child, her cousin, or something else was never clearly explained. A 1950 cartoon called Baby Wants Spinach has Olive specifically refer to Swee'Pea as her cousin. Then in the early 1960s King Features cartoons, the implication shifted again, this time towards Swee'Pea being Popeye's nephew. 3 different versions, none of them agreeing, all running under the same character name. For kids watching Saturday morning cartoons in the 1960s, the question of who exactly Swee'Pea was to Popeye probably never even registered, but the inconsistency was always there, hiding in plain sight. The voice behind that baby had its own remarkable story, too. Fact 7, the voice behind the baby. So Mae Questel was one of the most recognizable voices in animation history. She was the original voice of Betty Boop, the breathy, distinctive voice that defined that character from the very beginning. What most people don't realize is that she was also the voice of Swee'Pea. From 1936 to 1938, Questel provided the voice for the baby in Fleischer's animated Popeye shorts, the same woman voicing both the studio's most provocative adult character and its most innocent child character. When Fleischer Studios relocated from New York to Florida in 1938, Questel chose not to make the move, and Margie Hines took over the role through 1943. Questel later returned to voice Swee'Pea again in the 1960s cartoon shorts. It's one of those strange behind-the-scenes facts that changes how you hear both characters once you know it. Betty Boop and Swee'Pea, same voice, completely different worlds. Fact 8, his first cartoon came 3 years after the comics. Swee'Pea arrived in the comic strip in July 1933, but he didn't appear in an animated short until 1936, 3 full years later. The Fleischer cartoon Little Swee'Pea was his animated debut, and in it Popeye spends the entire short desperately trying to keep the baby out of danger while the baby wanders into every possible hazard without a care in the world. It set the template for basically every Swee'Pea cartoon that followed. The gap between his comics debut and his animation debut is worth noting. The Fleischer brothers were selective about which strip characters they brought to the screen, and Swee'Pea wasn't an obvious choice for a cartoon format. That 1936 short proved the concept worked, and he became a recurring presence in the series from that point on. The original short is also considered public domain today, due to its copyright not being renewed. Fact 9, famous studios nearly erased him. When Paramount Pictures took control of Fleischer Studios in 1942 and renamed it Famous Studios, the entire creative philosophy of the Popeye cartoons changed. Almost every character from the original Thimble Theater universe was dropped. The new studio focused almost entirely on a 3-character loop: Popeye, Olive, and Bluto, repeating variations of the same basic love triangle plot across 122 cartoons. Swee'Pea survived, but barely. Out of all those cartoons, he appeared in only a small handful. Most of his Famous Studios appearances were actually recycled footage from older Fleischer films. For the audience watching in the 1940s, Swee'Pea had effectively vanished. He was kept just enough to technically still exist, but the creative energy that had made him interesting was gone. He wouldn't return to regular animation appearances until the 1960s television series brought him back properly. But in the comics, while the cartoons were sidelining him, Swee'Pea's story had taken a turn nobody saw coming. Fact 10, he was secretly a king. In 1938, in one of the final major storylines that E.C. Segar himself worked on before his death later that year, a remarkable arc called King Swee'Pea revealed that the baby had royal blood. According to the storyline, Swee'Pea's birth father had been killed, and Swee'Pea was the rightful crown prince of a kingdom called Demonia. An evil uncle wanted him eliminated to seize the throne, and his mother had secretly placed him on Popeye's doorstep, knowing the sailor would keep him safe. The foundling baby in the nightgown was actually royalty, and Popeye, without knowing any of this, had been protecting a prince all along. It gave Swee'Pea an origin that was genuinely dramatic, buried inside a comic strip that most people thought was just about spinach and punching. Segar died in October 1938, leaving this as one of the last significant story contributions he made to the characters he created. Decades later, when Hollywood came calling, a real baby would bring Swee'Pea to life, and his family connection to the film was something nobody expected. Fact 11, a real baby played him in 1980. The 1980 live-action Popeye film, directed by Robert Altman, cast a real infant in the role of Swee'Pea. That infant was Wesley Ivan Hurt, and Wesley Ivan Hurt was Robert Altman's own grandson. The director cast his grandson in the film's most physically demanding infant role, which required the baby to be handled, carried, and filmed throughout production. The choice worked because Hurt had the kind of naturally expressive, unself-conscious quality that only real babies have. No amount of skilled adult performance can replicate it. The film used Swee'Pea as a central plot element, with the baby arriving in a switched basket and Popeye stepping up to protect him exactly the way he always had in the comics. Altman's decision to cast his own flesh and blood in the role adds a quiet, personal note to a film that was otherwise a big, chaotic studio production. Fact 12, he could predict the future. In the 1980 film, Swee'Pea wasn't just a baby who needed protecting, he was a baby who could foretell the future. The movie gave him the ability to answer yes or no questions about what was coming, signaling his response with a quick rising whistle. It was a power borrowed from another Popeye character, Eugene the Jeep, a magical animal from the original comics who had originally been planned for the film, but was eventually cut from the script. Rather than lose the ability entirely, the filmmakers transferred it to Swee'Pea. The result was a baby who could be used as a kind of oracle, which other characters in the film quickly figured out and tried to exploit. It added a dimension to the character that had never existed in any previous version, turning the helpless infant into someone with genuine, unusual power. For a movie full of odd choices, it was one of the more inventive ones. Back on television, Swee'Pea got yet another upgrade, one that connected him directly to Popeye's most famous habit. Fact 13, spinach made him a superhero in the 70s. When Hanna-Barbera Productions took over Popeye animation with the all-new Popeye Hour in 1978, they stayed closer to the spirit of the original Fleischer cartoons than the show's predecessors had. And in their version, they gave Swee'Pea something new. Whenever the baby ate spinach, he temporarily transformed into a superhero. It was a direct parallel to Popeye's own spinach-powered strength. The same logic applied to the smallest member of the crew, and the gimmick gave Swee'Pea his own recurring story hook and made him more active in plots, rather than just a babysitting problem for Popeye to manage. For kids watching in the late 1970s, it made perfect sense. Of course, the baby would get superpowers from spinach, too. It was also a tidy way to keep the character relevant in a format that demanded every character carry their own weight, literally and figuratively. And then, more than 70 years after he first appeared in the comics, something happened that nobody in 1933 could have imagined. Fact 14, he was officially adopted in real life. In November 2004, in New York City, Popeye officially adopted Swee'Pea in a formal ceremony. The event was hosted by the National Council for Adoption and officiated by Judge Greg Mathis. It was, of course, a symbolic and promotional occasion. Popeye is a cartoon character, but it was conducted with all the ceremonial elements of a real adoption proceeding. The event was organized partly to raise awareness for National Adoption Month and to celebrate the idea of non-traditional families in American culture. For a character who had spent more than 70 years existing in a legal and narrative gray area, sometimes Popeye's son, sometimes Olive's cousin, sometimes royalty in disguise, the ceremony gave Swee'Pea a kind of official standing that the comics had never quite managed to pin down. It was a strange, sweet moment for a strange, sweet character. That little baby in the white nightgown started as a throwaway, a box on a doorstep, a joke name, a single sound effect. And somewhere along the way, he accumulated more history, more versions, and more genuine strangeness than most characters get in a lifetime. Swee'Pea never drove the story. He was never the one throwing punches or eating spinach. But without him, Popeye was just a sailor. With him, Popeye was a father. And that changed everything about who that character was. Sometimes the smallest figures carry the most weight. Swee'Pea always did.